All right. So, Dr. Crista, thank you for rearranging after our first conversation went not to plan, shall we say.
Yes. No problem. It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
No, thank you. So, starting from scratch, Dr. Crista, would you be happy to share a little bit of your journey and your work for those people that might not be yet familiar with you?
Yeah, I'm a naturopathic doctor and US trained. And I started a practice in primary care and I ended up being in a Lyme endemic area. So I ended up starting with Lyme disease patients. And there, if anyone isn't familiar with Lyme disease, it's kind of a complex condition if it's gone chronic, and people can be really hard to figure out. Lyme is called the great imitator. And so I had this subset of patients that weren't really responding. We have pretty good luck with Lyme disease with natural medicine because we're treating the cause. And with Lyme, the causes are so many different things: inflammation, bacteria, all that. And so I had this group of patients that just weren't responding, this little subset. And in one of those patients' homes, they found black mold. And I remember thinking, I wonder if that's what's going on with this guy, that he has this terrible ear ringing we can't get under control, the pelvic pain, the insomnia, the anxiousness. It's just sort of, I always chalked it up to the Lyme things.
Right.
And as I got into the research, I realized, oh yeah, this is definitely what's going on with this guy. I wonder if that's what's going on with this person and all the people, the rest of the people in that subgroup. And found that mold was found in those patients, or prior exposure to a water damaged building was consistent in almost every single one of those cases. So it was that was my eye-opening moment of, I'm going to really need to understand mold. Because I said I had a cursory understanding of it from environmental medicine. We're trained as naturopathic doctors in environmental medicine. So I had an understanding that it was more than what I call spore illness. Spore illness is what the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, their definition of mold illness is basically things that have to do with interaction with spores. So allergies, hay fever, asthma. But most of my mold sick patients didn't really have respiratory symptoms at all. Some had some sinusitis, but it was mainly neurological, immunological, toxic things. And so that was a big eye opener for me, that also mold is a great imitator. And then we had mold in my own home. And this is after being, a mold expert and treating all these, getting referred people that were sick from mold because, this doctor, she knows what to do. And when it happened to myself, it took 3 months for the flood to reveal itself. And in that 3 months, my whole family, even our dog, started to exhibit symptoms, but I didn't pick up on it.
Wow.
And when it revealed itself, we were able to get right on the treatment. I knew what to do. I had all the connections for our building because I'd worked with enough patients on their remediations. So, I called in my posse. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, I really feel duty bound to write a book, because I knew exactly what to do. We were able to respond. And a lot of people in that situation don't know, and that they have all the tools they need right there. Most of the people that are getting better from mold don't need medication. They don't need prescriptions. They need a plan. And these are all things, the nutrients and the herbs and things are things that people can do on their own. So that suddenly I became an author.
Amazing.
Surprise. Yeah.
And do
Yep.
you have an online course now as well?
I do. I have a training course for doctors. One of the problems about writing a book, or benefits of writing a book, is then you get a lot of people that call and say, hey, can you work with me? And it's
Okay.
just not possible to do that. I was already full with my own patient load. So my heart really went out to all of these people suffering that did need to see a mold literate doctor. And so I created a course for doctors. And now that's really where my focus is teaching other doctors, not just teaching them to fish, or, not to fishing with them, but teaching them how to fish, so to speak. So yeah, and that's for any healthcare practitioner that's working with mold sick patients.
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So for those people that this might be a relatively new topic for, you've mentioned kind of this idea of spores and mycotoxins, molds. Are we able to I guess what differentiates some of these concepts?
Yes. So I think that my view of this is a little unique, even in the
Okay.
mold treating world. I'm on a mission to really expand the definition of mold illness. Like I said, the CDC's definitions are all spore related things.
Mm,
So that means that the spores have to come in contact with your skin or your respiratory passages, maybe even your gut, and your body has some localized reaction to that spore.
okay.
Well, spores are really pretty large. And so if we look at where they get in our respiratory passages, they don't really go very deep into those respiratory passages. If a spore breaks up into tiny fragments, then it can get a little deeper. But the most of the patients that I was seeing, 75% or so of the symptoms aren't related to the spores at all. Often the spores are trapped behind building material, and their chemicals and their toxins can seep through building material and are in the indoor air, riding around on these ultra fine particulates, these little dust particles that you can't see with the human eye. Mycotoxins and chemicals, because they're so small, they don't get coughed out or moved out by our respiratory passages. So those get deep into the lungs and then come right into our blood system. You can also eat them, and you can also absorb them through skin. So my mission is like, we need to think of this as a bigger thing than just the things that we would associate with spores. We have to understand what mold does. It's kind of a unique thing that the normal metabolism of a mold, if it's just chunking along as a factory, it's making all of these chemicals like exhaust, like a factory exhaust. I kind of joke that they're called mold farts, that they're just metabolism. And that these are pretty hard chemicals for some people to tolerate. This is VOCs, alcohols. We know one, yeast makes alcohol. We understand this.
Mm,
Aldehydes. So that's just the normal metabolism mold. So if mold is growing, it can be behind building material, and those chemicals can come into your indoor environment, even if the spores can't. But then there's this other super toxic gas bomb that it will secrete to compete out other critters. So if it finds a sweet spot in your built environment in your house or your bathroom or whatever, it will try to hold on to that property and will gas bomb out any other microbe that's around, including bacteria. So sometimes we will see then the other microbes fight back. And so you can get this mixed
huh.
bad guy biofilm kind of thing going on inside that indoor environment. We're not really the targets of that, but we get hit in the crossfire. Did that help? And these are called mycotoxins. And the
Okay.
mycotoxins are, they're super toxic to living systems. We're familiar with a mycotoxin. If you think about the bread and, making penicillin, you've got the bread, you've got the mold in the middle, and then there's this sterile ring around the mold where nothing can grow. And we use that as penicillin for antibiotics. Penicillin is a mycotoxin. So we're very familiar with its ability to kill other microbes. We use it therapeutically for that. But if you're living in that environment where you're continuously inhaling and absorbing those toxins, you can understand then all of the reasons and the different things that can cause in a body.
That's
So yeah,
amazing.
it's kind of
Yeah,
crazy.
it is crazy. Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. So with that in mind, what are, unless you think maybe there's a better place to go at this point in time, but what can be some of the signs and symptoms, or what are some of the ways that mycotoxins can impact, I guess, on our health then?
Yeah. So the different areas in the body that it impacts is immune. So it's immune toxic. These mycotoxins are GI toxic. They can actually cause leaky gut syndrome and winnow away the lining of our GI system. So it gets in the way of so many things that have to do with health. They're skin toxic. So you can get rashes. They're toxic to our liver and kidneys, which are organs of detoxification. They're gene toxic, so they can actually rewire the genes to make us more immune deficient and susceptible. And they're neurotoxic, so they're a nerve toxin. And so we can see some kind of strange neurological, excuse me, sec.
That's okay.
Sorry, I didn't want to have you edit anything. So the nerve toxic part makes it these strange things like ear ringing, pelvic pain, atypical MS, or it just might be that whatever your tricky nerve thing is, if it's sciatica, it makes it a little worse. It can actually, some of these can go through the brain as well and irritate the brain, and that causes a lot of anxiousness and brain fog and fatigue and that kind of thing. So as far as categories, you see why a lot of doctors are missing this, because it's like everything.
Yeah.
And the mycotoxins are fat soluble. That's what makes them very unique. And when I'm teaching the doctors, I think, now think about all of the places that makes a difference. The brain is mostly fat. Our nervous system is lined by fat. Myelin sheathing is fat. Our, our fat is fat, but also our glands and organs are coated in these linings. Every single cell of our body is coated with fat. Our mitochondria have a membrane of fat. So these mycotoxins can get all the way down to that level, down to the mitochondria and down to the genes, which is terrifying.
Yeah. that's
So for me in clinic, I created a questionnaire. If there's any practitioners listening, you're welcome to the questionnaire. You can just email me through my website. It's a clinical questionnaire that gives someone a risk score of probability that there might be mold as a cause for their symptoms. I put it in the book as well, in the front of the book.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether it's the same
version. Yeah.
Okay.
Same thing. Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
Yeah. So have you had a chance to take the questionnaire?
You know what? I haven't sort of actually taken it, but I've gone through it sort of reading the book. It's terrible that I didn't just do it at the time, but it's on the to-do list, certainly.
It's good to do before you start learning about mold, just so you get sort of a baseline, unadulterated
kind
of thing. Because
yeah, I'm certainly curious about it, because it seems to be almost, let me try and put this in a sensible way, within my client sort of cohort, it seems to be almost at epidemic proportions.
Yes.
So many of my clients come back positive for mycotoxins.
Yes, and I think I was reading, our OSHA estimates that over 25% of all buildings here have had enough water damage to host toxic mold. More than 50% have had water damage. So, that gets tossed around a lot. Like, whoa, no, it's 50%. Not all water events are going to grow toxic mold, but they do estimate that about a little over 25% have had enough to host these toxic molds. And I was reading that in the UK that's higher. That's quite a bit higher. Do you find that to be true?
I think so. I think maybe just because of, we've got so many old properties as well. But the number of clients I've had recently I have one client who literally was having mushrooms growing in their bathroom. It was that sort of severe. It's not a rare situation. I had a client just before our call, a new client who for the last 25 years has been basically trying to manage his health. He had depression as a teenager, and ever since then there have been all sorts of different symptoms and diagnoses. And he's incredibly sensitive to carbohydrates. He's come back positive on IgG testing, which he had done previously, to yeast, and I think he mentioned milk as well. He's just a very sensitive person, and interestingly, his entire family have some elements of a health issue, which does stem back to when he was 15 years old. So I guess there's this theory, which is, the property had some degree of water damage, mold, and mycotoxins, and potentially it was influencing all of them.
And what we see, and this is what makes my treatment and my theories a little bit different from the general understanding with like Dr. Shoemaker and things like that, is what my understanding, and the theory could be wrong, but I base my treatment protocol off this theory. So the treatment's working, but it's, feel free to correct my theory, but it seems to be that once someone is exposed to that water damage building, that the symptoms and the conditions is sort of on a continuum. So the initial thing is that you get that exposure and your own flora gets alarmed, because your own flora are all of these things too. If we did testing of sick from a water damage building and healthy people, we would find the same bacteria and the same primarily the same fungus in everybody's sinuses. The difference between the healthy people and the sick people is now the sick people, if you do nasal washings, you can find mycotoxins. So my understanding of that is that if you're exposed to a water damage building at a certain degree, and that's going to be based on your genetic susceptibility, your nutrition status, your previous exposure to water damage buildings, but you get that exposure and your own flora starts to make mycotoxins.
Huh.
And then if that goes on long enough, then it can become immune deficiency and you get that
Right.
disruption of the fungal balance in the body, like you were talking about, carbohydrate intolerance, candida overgrowth, that kind of thing. And then if that goes long enough, then the actual molds from that building can move into your sinuses and into your lungs. And that's when we see invasive fungal infections. So
Okay.
on this continuum, though, the very beginning of that continuum is your own flora reacting because it doesn't feel safe anymore. So
Huh.
your sinu biome turns into biofilm, pathogenic biofilm. So what that means is that someone can, the reason I came to that theory, because I was like, how can it be that this exposure was in college
Mm.
20 years ago, and there's no evidence of water damage exposure since then, and you're still sick with mold? And I think it's because that thing that it can trigger that to turn on, and now you've got an internal milieu that is basically making endogenous toxin. So that's why I do antifungals, and that's why I make sure that we treat systemically and intranasally, because so many times just that another moldy hotel exposure or moldy restaurant or the gym or, you know, church or something like that, or you go to camp, and it can trigger all of this old stuff up again.
Mm. Yeah, it does seem that people have, as you say, a spectrum of sensitivity, because I have some clients who feel like they know if there's a mold issue in a property, because they'll walk in and it will just kind of hit them in the face, sort of symptomatically. They will
Mm-hmm.
be aware they've just reacted to something in that environment. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah. I call
yeah,
those mold canaries. They're like the canaries in the coal mine, you know, and
right.
they're great to have around. Like you have one of them in your group because if they're reacting, you know that you need to get out of there. You know,
Yeah.
that's the thing is that if it doesn't have to smell musty. It they won't smell musty unless those spores are exposed to the air. So if they're trapped behind building materials, mycotoxins have no scent at all. So you
Mm.
could be walking into a building and the mold canary knows there's mold in there, but nobody else can sense it.
Yeah.
So they're a great friend to have in your in your group. They keep you
Yeah.
protected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, and with this idea that mycotoxins, they can have an impact on the flora, and there is almost an antibiotic type element to this scenario.
Yes.
I I'm working on sort of almost an audit at the moment, because I'm starting to think that a lot of my people who do have mycotoxin issues often come back with suboptimal microbiome diversity in some of the stool test markers that some of the labs do. Is that something
Hmm.
that makes sense and that maybe you've seen?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. We see microbiome kind of things just completely disordered.
Mm,
You'll see a reduction in diversity in the bacteria and an increased diversity in the fungal.
yeah. Okay.
Because there's no
Excellent.
competition. You know, they're
Yeah.
basically inhaling antibiotics. Isn't that crazy?
That is
I mean, when
crazy.
we really just step back, and then also the toxins. So I have a joke, inhale water damage air, get drunk, because it's the same kind of alcohols that we would make in beer and wine and
Mm,
liquor that you're inhaling. So that's why we see brain fog, fatigue, visual disruption, a lot of the things that we would see with somebody who's intoxicated.
yeah. And I add, this might be sound a little bit extreme, but I have clients who just wake up hungover and they haven't been
Yes.
drinking. And I've
Yes,
always kind of put it
exactly.
partly to that as a potential explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, good call. That's right.
Which is, not good when you don't have to drink and you're waking up
No.
with with a hangover.
No. And also, if they're exposed to some of these mycotoxins that can cross the blood-brain barrier, they're
Mm,
not necessarily getting the melatonin that they need. And we know that
right.
melatonin is one of the best brain antioxidants there is. So I put melatonin in my book for that very reason, because I find that if I can add it to someone's protocol preemptively before we go killing the mold or resetting the fungal balance is really the way I think of it more. That when what we've seen studies is that when you start to administer an antifungal, so amphotericin B on an Aspergillus species, Fumigatus, it will kick up its production of gliotoxin. So we know that when we start to target these fungi that have overgrown, they're going to defend themselves. And so that's part of the treatment that I have, is that, we have to really prep the body to be ready for that. But that whole thing about waking up hungover, a lot of these people don't have enough melatonin. They're using up all of it in the inflammatory response.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And actually, when you sort of comment on the melatonin, it reminded me that also some of my clients are essentially renting a property where it's sort of a one up, one down type property. So there's almost like a 1 in 4 chance that the dampness in the mold is in the bedroom. And often that seems to be the case with some of my clients. So they're also getting that direct exposure for 8 hours at night, which I can only imagine is going to then just drive particular symptoms in the morning at the end of that sort of just ongoing exposure.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I really feel for people in rental situations where, they just feel out of control, of the environment. And there's so much suppression of the information of buildings that are damaged, and suppression of human data. I mean, that's one of the things I talk about in my training course. I wish I was handing over all of these human clinical trials, but it's so odd to me that there are very few. And so, I think that that's purposeful, because there's a lot of people that will have to spend a lot of money to remediate, and, building owners and occupational exposures and all these things. So I'm hoping that by getting the word out and getting people's awareness, that people will start to advocate more. My next project is to try to create a change in our building policy so that we're building buildings that are mold resistant.
Wow.
That's where,
that's cool.
where I'm heading. Yeah. Because it just
really
breaks my heart. These families that are stuck in these situations and the whole family is sick.
Yeah.
That's so unfair and unnecessary.
Well, it's like your experience. I think there's a published study that I'm sure you've read that, the dog was sick as well.
Yes.
It's just crazy.
Yeah. We need to help
So,
people.
with all that sort of slight doom and gloom.
Yeah, I know. This is the part in the interview people are terrified and turning it off.
What, from maybe a global perspective to start with, how do we get the mycotoxins, I guess, out of the body to begin with? And then maybe if we're able to dive into some of the specific things that we could just at least consider to support ourselves or to support our clients, for the practitioners listening, just sort of a little overview if you're happy to.
Sure. So it's important to remember the mycotoxins are fat soluble. So it was drilled into me from my environmental medicine instructors, the solution to pollution is dilution. So people can just put that little rhyme in their head. That really is the way to get them out. You have to assist the body in doing that. But, if you just kind of, like you said, the global view is the solution to pollution is dilution. So you dilute, this is my alliteration so that I can remember, with copious, clean, correct fats. So that's my little, 10,000 foot view. So you have to feed your body fat, good fats, clean fats, organic fats, the right fats, the more runny ones, not the more firm ones, that kind of thing. So big picture, it doesn't have to be really complicated. Even canola oil is okay as long as it's organic. It's not ideal, but it's better than swimming in a toxic soup. So what we're talking about with the good fats is olive oil, fish, walnuts, walnut oil, avocados, avocado oil, all of these essential fatty acids, and anything that you read where someone's saying this is a good fat. Even butter is okay as long as it's clean and organic. Coconut oil, clean and organic, just making sure that you're getting enough good fats, but put more emphasis on the runny ones, because if you're trying to dilute something like soap, it's a lot easier to use liquid soap than a bar of soap,
Right.
so that so big picture that, it's just kind of easy learning. And then our focus is going to be on tons and tons of bioflavonoids. So people need to eat the rainbow every day. I counsel my patients that they have to eat 5 to 7 servings of vegetables every day, and try to make sure most of that is non-starchy. and try to make sure they're hitting something from every color band in the rainbow. Each band of color, each bioflavonoid, that's the colorful pigment in food, each one kind of has its affinity for different tissues in the body and does different things. So if you're really, really good about getting your greens, awesome. And the bulk of that should be green because we are foliage dependent. We evolved to eat a lot of foliage. That's where folic acid comes from, is foliage. But if you're great about doing that, but you don't really like things that are orange, let's say you're not really a carrot fan or a squash fan, take that as a supplement. Remember that mycotoxins have already taken away your ability to absorb good nutrients in your gut. They are terribly hard on the gut. Think about being on an antibiotic for years and years at a time. So you need a lot of these bioflavonoids. Your body is sort of like a sieve. So you lose nutrients faster than you take them in. So when people look at my dosing of things, they think, whoa, it's a little heavy-handed, isn't it? And for me, it's what's working because there's the absorptive capacity is so low. So copious clean, correct fats, tons of bioflavonoids. And I purposefully said vegetables and not fruit. A lot of people who have water damage exposure also have candida overgrowth, and they get really disordered if they get too much sweet. I've learned that the hard way, that by having patients, say, well, I was really good about doing my smoothie in the morning. And then, maybe I'd have some carrots, which are also very sweet. And then I'd have some sweet potato. And, so they were really good about getting all the sweeties and the fruit, and ended up with a lot of candida overgrowth that was confusing the picture. So I try to limit my patients to one piece of fruit a day and go for something really colorful, like wild blueberries or something like that. But if you're doing a big old glass of smoothie where you've added, a whole banana, a whole apple, all the blueberries, if you thought about sitting down and eating all of that fruit, no wonder that your digestion is sluggish, after eating this huge smoothie. So try to keep the smoothies in the morning if you're a smoothie person, to mostly veggie. So those little tips and tricks of how to really work it into your life, it doesn't have to be rocket science, And then the foods to focus on are things that have a bitter flavor. And we're seeing right now with COVID, one of the things that's being really protective is surfactant, having a good hearty amount of surfactant in your lungs. This is something that gets particularly hit hard for people who have had water damage, building exposure, and have mold illness. They start to get sluggish bile. And how the connection there is that bile is a component of surfactant. So people who have water damage building exposure have less functioning surfactant in their lungs. Surfactant not only keeps the lungs open, but it also plays a role in the immunity of the lungs. So for the people I'm working with now, I'm like, bitter, 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 bitter needs to be your mantra. Eating bitter greens, arugula every day, trying to make sure that you're getting steeping your green tea till it's really bitter. If you're a coffee person, have some coffee in the morning. Don't be worried about it. Make sure it's clean, not moldy coffee, like Bulletproof or something like that. But bitter needs to be added to your regimen. So copious, clean, correct fats, tons of veggies, and then add something bitter to every meal so that you can move bile, bitters move bile, and make bile, and then help protect your lungs from getting infection. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Cool, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our bodies are so cool. Yeah. And then next in the focus is just, what are your weak systems that are getting toxic from these mycotoxins? Get those supported. And then we really have to take down the fungus. So if you think about mycotoxins are the smoke, the fungus is the fire. So we have to do something that puts the fire out. So for me, that's antifungal plants. Some patients, once they're down the road of actual fungal infection, will have to use pharmaceuticals. But I never prescribe a pharmaceutical without prescribing a plant with it, so that the plant is giving the pharmaceutical directions.
Okay.
And we see reduced drug resistance, reduced side effects when we do that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's like the overview.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. What's your view on, things just like potato and grains? Are they a complete no-no, or is it person dependent?
It's grower dependent and person dependent.
Okay.
So if they are dealing with a candida overgrowth, a frank, invasive candidiasis, that kind of thing, then grains and potatoes, starches are really, they need to go. But I'm cautious about how long that goes on, because I do think that people need those grains. I think that they need some amount. If they're not able to get good quality seeds in their diet, they're going to need some of that fiber to rebalance the diversity in the gut. But grower dependent, meaning that part of the problem with those is not just their carb load. It is that they're very prone to having mycotoxin contamination because of how we mass grow and mass store. In my area, I was driving to go visit my son, and there's this huge pile of corn that had come out of the field that they had, de-hulled and whatever. And it was raining. It was pouring rain, and this corn was just out in the rain. And it was going to be used as animal feed. And then that's why dairy is a problem for some people. If you're getting organic dairy, a lot of my patients can tolerate dairy just fine as long as it's organic. And I think the connection there is that those CAFOs, those large, dairies, that they're not necessarily being careful that they're feeding the cows and the pigs and all those kind of things that we get our food from, the chickens. That's why eggs are a problem for some people, because they're creating these foods that are high in fat that we ingest. And so if it's a fat soluble toxin, they're concentrating that toxin, and then we are ingesting it in the food. So I have a lot of patients who do just fine with organic, locally grown potatoes, like a CSA, that's a shared agriculture kind of thing. Or do you have CSAs in the UK? I don't know.
I haven't heard of it before.
Okay, it's like a community supported agriculture. So we have those in the States, and there's got to be something like that, like a local farm cooperative or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So a lot of my patients that don't have the carb overload problem can do organic local potatoes, no problem, but eating them in season. Organic grain that's been in my area, our CSA is just wonderful. He grows wheat and quinoa and all these things. And after they harvest it, it goes right in the freezer. So it just stops that process right away. And then you buy it from them right out of the freezer so that you know that it's not grown mold in the process.
Right.
Yeah. Amazing. So I think, just paying attention to where our food comes from, it's a big lesson that we get all the time.
Yeah. And I used to be, I guess, almost a little bit confused around the importance of the food element of things, because there is, when I looked, certainly, and it might just have been my perception, but there was most of the sort of published literature on mycotoxins was around food, ultimately, and food being a source of it. And I wasn't sure how it related to, you and I in the US and UK compared to someone in an Eastern African country, and maybe it's more of a problem for them than it is for us. But maybe that was a little bit naive in regards to our food system.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I really like that you brought that up, because I think that has been a purposeful distraction for this conversation. So again, there's people with a lot of money that stand to lose a lot of money if water damage building exposure is actually making humans sick. So I think it was partly part of that distraction. That's what we see in legal cases when I'm trying to defend people. The lawyers have it down pat that, it's just from the food. They just have to clean up their diet. They're just drunks. They just need to stop drinking. So I think that's part of the defense that insurance companies have figured out. Not that it isn't happening. And again, if you're supporting locally grown organic food and you're eating seasonally, you're going to have more chance of having no problem with your food, having good, clean food.
Right.
The more you're eating mass-produced junk food, things that are corporate supporting, we just have, that's a big operation, and certainly there are going to be some contamination issues.
Yeah, no, definitely. And before I forget, actually, when you're talking about the fruit side of things, I find a lot of people with mycotoxin stuff often have histamine issues. So there's kind of another reason why we want to be a bit mindful of certainly some of our fruit anyway.
Right. I see strawberry allergy a lot with people with mold toxicity. Yeah. So, it's mast cell activation syndrome, histamine issues. That is so common in the water damage building exposed people. There are some, I've been trying to find the link, the enzymatic link, and there is some shutdown of histone methyltransferase. So it has to do with your ability to detoxify. And mast cells are tricky because once they're stimulated, they have to burn themselves out. So
Right.
the game in histamine response is to prevent the histamine from ever being triggered, and that's really tricky. People it's hard. If you I don't know if you read Dr. Ben Lynch's book Dirty Genes.
Yes.
He has a great section in there about histamine foods and how to help support that if you have the gene. But even people that don't have the DAO gene,
DAO.
even people without that polymorphism or that SNP are having trouble with histamine with the mold reaction. Mm-hmm.
Huh. Okay.
And that doesn't even have to mean a mold allergy. So, if you go and send these people for allergy testing, they can be really histaminic. So have really bad histamine issues, mast cell activation, and have a completely normal mold IgE allergy test. Mm-hmm. And conversely, if you have a positive IgE allergy test, that doesn't mean, or I'm sorry, a negative one, that doesn't mean you don't have mold sickness, because that means you're just not exposed to the spores. That means that your water damage building exposure either happened long ago and it's now you endogenously infecting yourself, or that water damage building exposure is spores trapped behind building material and you're just getting the mycotoxin part.
Interesting. Okay. And I've never seen any published research on this, but I've certainly heard a few people comment on the concept that, I think I'm right in saying they say that Candida can inhibit or at least affect our ability to metabolize histamine. Is that something?
I don't know. I know that if you have Candida overgrowth, you have an oxalate issue because they do spit out oxalate. So that might be the connection there.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, that's why antifungals are such a key part to my treatment. In the book, I have the orange because it gives you sort of a visual idea of the order of things, because I've found that the order of things is really important. But the antifungals, like in the Shoemaker protocol, they don't use antifungals, but it's because the tools there are so limited. You're using drugs with major side effects. So they have to kind of wait until somebody has an infection to validate, the need for that medication. But using plants, we can institute those right away. When people say, they look at my orange, and I can describe it in a minute, but when people say, oh, I didn't want to start antifungals, for a couple of months, and there's no date on it. It's just, please consider all of those things and get your patient ready or your client ready before you start poking the bear. So the orange, the idea was that the two most important things that need to be done pretty much 100% are the first two steps. And that's why I used an orange, because that's if you're going to eat an orange, you need to peel the orange part and that white fluffy stuff. And those first two are avoidance and fundamentals. And then the inside sections, you pick and choose the things from that work for you, that are going to be supportive for you. And that's protect, repair, and then fight. So if you don't peel the orange, you can't get to the middle meaty stuff. So what I mean by that is that avoidance is the number one thing. Some people just get out of the mold and they get better. They don't need any more treatment. It's awesome because they had the nutrition status was there. They didn't have the genetics, no prior exposure to water damage building. They didn't take stuff with them that's probably still sick, like an occupational exposure. But we do see in studies that with occupational exposure, over 50% of people still have symptoms even after getting out of that building. Huh. Yeah. Wow. And so that's, again, another reason for the book is okay, do this stuff then, maybe it can help you. Yeah.
Excellent. And I think from memory, I'm hoping I'm right with my memory here, that in your book, you also talk about sort of the importance of the breath.
Yes.
Which I love.
Yeah. So there's a few things with breath that if you are sick, you have mold sickness, and you're doing that endogenous, your own flora in your sinuses has now been triggered to be bad guy biofilm. Every time you inhale, you are inhaling toxins. And every time you exhale, you're sharing toxins. But if you think about on the inhale, then what does your body do to protect you? It'll create an underbreathing situation because it doesn't want to take in too much toxin.
Yeah.
So once you treat that, and we do see that that goes away completely once those mycotoxins go away when you're treated, but then you really have to do some breath work to realign your breathing and get that vagal nerve breathing going again, because your body has done you a favor to make you an underbreather,
Yeah,
protect you. Isn't that something?
that is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
That is really amazing. And what was, as an underbreather, what are we sort of referring to there? If someone's listening and they're going, and they're wondering maybe what you mean by that, or is there any
Mm-hmm.
sort of telltale sign that someone's an underbreather, like sighing or?
Oh yeah, sighing, yawning. Um, what I try to do is have people hold their breath, just like do a normal breath. Don't do a big, but just like a normal breath, and then mid exhale, just hold your breath and see how long you can hold it. And I have patients that can't hold more than 4 seconds. So
Wow.
we know that they're dealing with so much CO2 and acidity in their lungs that they can't hold their breath. And we want you to be able to, in that situation where you didn't really plan, like a big exhale and then a deep inhale and then a big
Yeah.
exhale again, a deep inhale. That's not really what I'm trying to measure. I'm trying to measure, what are you dealing with on a daily basis when you're
Right.
not thinking about your breathing? So I kind of sneak up on them. Like, I don't know, hold your breath right now. Don't take a breath, hold it. And let me know when you need to breathe again. And if they're not able to go 25 seconds or more, then they're an underbreather. It's just kind of a fun little clinical test.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And I guess from a breath perspective, just thinking about maybe other elements, there's sort of the lymph side of things, which has come up on a couple of conversations recently, whereby that sort of diaphragmatic breathing is influencing lymph, which is
Mm-hmm.
important from an immune sort of detoxification perspective.
Absolutely. We see, back to the breath piece too, we see a lot of insomnia based on this underbreathing habit, because the body will need to get into a deep breath state. And if your vagal tone is so disordered that when you check out to breathe, basically, and your body is not getting the breath it needs, it will do a little cortisol surge. It'll just say, ooh, wake up a little bit, breathe, breathe, breathe. We need a little more oxygen for the tissue repair we're doing. So you get that, like one of my patients describes it as floating above the sheets sleep. Like, I'm not really deep sleep, I'm kind of hovering. And then that area, or that time in our circadian rhythm, is when we really do a lot of the cleaning out. Our brain drains, we have these glymphatics. 90% of that is when we're sleeping. Well, if you don't have good vagal tone, you're not breathing, your body is hovering you above the sheets so that you keep breathing at a faster, more frenetic pace, you don't get that brain drain either. And that glymphatic movement, and then of course the body movement as well, the body lymph. And that's why one of the things that I send a lot of patients for is lymphatic massage.
Yeah.
And if they're real toxic, like, they will be wiped out after that. We often have to do some sort of extra binder on lymphatic massage day,
Okay.
just to try to make sure that they can, get rid of all of the stuff that just got moved.
Huh.
Because they don't
Amazing.
get the lymph movement in their sleep time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
I can see
Excellent.
that you're like, there are some clients that are like coming
Yeah.
through.
No, it's just so many. I think, as I say, I just think I'm hard to find at the moment a client where I'm not wanting and have a reason to test mycotoxins where it's not coming back positive. It really is an interesting an area that I'm kind of fascinated with.
Right. And there's a selection bias there, like for people listening,
Yeah.
they're, oh, so everybody has mold, I mean, like we have mold goggles on. The thing is that when you've been in practice long enough, these are the people that are still coming back to see you because you haven't figured it out.
Right.
So you get that selection bias of, like, more people in the world have mold sickness than not, but it's because the people that didn't have it, you already got better and they've already moved on.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why, for anyone listening, if they're like, because I get accused of having my Lyme goggles on, and then I found out about mold, and then everybody had mold. It was just because I was working with people that have not yet been restored back to health.
Yeah, and that is a really key point, and one that I can sort of reiterate ultimately, because I think my journey into sort of the world of mycotoxins was really because people were either coming back or they had been with other practitioners, had success, but it was kind of short term, and then we're looking for just a new set of eyes to kind of look over their case kind of thing. And I found it really liberating, because often there were people who had been diagnosed with SIBO. They'd gone through
Yes.
all the normal SIBO stuff, sort of had some relief from the diet and the antimicrobials, but were never 100%, or if they did, they kind of relapsed within a few weeks. And therefore we were just forced to look outside the box, basically.
Right.
And then I just started seeing the theme ultimately.
Yes.
So I now see mostly clients who have gone through a process, and we're now kind of looking outside the box ultimately. And I think mycotoxins, it's about time they get inside the box.
Yes. That's right. Time to move it sooner in our differential.
Yeah, I think so.
That's, you were asking some of the symptoms, there's the everything kind of picture, that it creates so many different symptoms and so many different systems in the body. But then there's some quirky ones that, you start to go, oh, I wonder if that, like you said, disordered by fruit and carbohydrates, ear ringing. You look at some of the common side effects of drugs that are mycotoxins, antibiotics, and statins. And then you start to make a connection of like what mold sickness might look like if somebody is getting a lot of those toxins. So statins, we know, deplete CoQ10. Statins are made from a mycotoxin. So we know that mycotoxins deplete CoQ10. So obviously CoQ10 needs to be part of your, repletion for that patient. And not everybody has a really bad CoQ10 status. So it doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying that every mold sick patient needs it, but it should be kind of in your floating differential when you start to see bad reaction to antibiotic, bad reaction to statins, cholesterol numbers are really disordered, liver enzymes are high. So those are things that clinicians are looking for, but symptomatically it's sort of like random skin problems, tinnitus, urinary frequency, interstitial cystitis, irritable bowel, so that's why SIBO is really common to be a comorbidity with mold toxicity.
Yeah. And I've kind of thought about that almost from a compromised immune perspective. Like there's just a lot of the resources that for the body are gone or going towards the mycotoxins, or maybe some other toxin as well. And as a result, there aren't enough resources essentially to maintain a healthy microbiome. But what you're also saying is potentially that there is just this kind of antibiotic type element to it as well.
And nerve toxic. So when the mycotoxins are in the gut, it gets taken up into those lacteals and it disrupts the myenteric plexus. So we see a lot of motility issues that set the stage for SIBO. It's like a perfect storm for creating SIBO.
Yeah, it really is. Okay.
And I don't know if anyone has taken, for practitioners, I highly recommend Dr. Nirala Jacoby's SIBO course, especially if you're seeing mold patients also, because there are some times when adding more bile, even though I'm a bilophile, there are times when adding more bile can actually harm your SIBO patient if they have a certain type of SIBO. I love taking her class. I was just like, all these things. Because my thing is like, I'm trying to figure out for the mold sick patients that can't just do the normal protocol and get better, what are the fine tuning things that we as clinicians can do to help them? Let's get there faster, reduce suffering.
And I guess that's a great example of just the complexity of it, which is, the uniqueness of whether we want to be supporting bile or not, for example, just like a fundamental clinical decision that you would have thought we may want to, but in some circumstances could be the last thing we want to do.
Yeah. And I would say they're the rarer ones. So, and they're going to be the patients that you'll know, they, okay, I added arugula and, got worse or whatever. It might be because they couldn't have raw, but it's, if you start to add the bitters and they can't tolerate it in the gut, then that's the time to really look into SIBO and say, what's going on? Are we making the situation worse? So we need to do something else for a little while so that the body can tolerate the bile acids.
Okay.
But I don't want to scare people listening, if they're like, oh, it's too complicated, I can't do it. most of the people I've heard from, so many people who got the book, did the steps, used the protocol, and they're doing great. They say it was a lifesaver. And these are people who have done other types of protocols where it's just binding, which I think of as just mopping up smoke. It's not really taking care of the nutritional deficiencies, all of the things, the antifungals and those kind of things. So I would say the majority of the moldies, if they really, really get out of the moldy environment or remediate it, and do, the things that you have control over, they get better. You and I see the people that they have other comorbidities that they need a little more support. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's another, I guess, really important point to appreciate this. The whole concept is on a spectrum. So you have people who are really ill, some who have some minor symptoms and have just, I guess, a lighter load, a lighter burden from a toxicity perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, not everyone is kind of to the same degree debilitated.
Right. Yeah. Often, I work with all manner in the beginning. Now I'm seeing, of course, the more complicated cases, but, I saw a competitive athlete who wanted to improve his VO2 max. And we found that he had mold in his home. And, this is a competitive athlete. This guy was a, mountain biker. He was scoring high, he was very competitive, very high level. And it did improve his VO2 max, by the way, because we're talking about that whole breathing thing and the CO2 balance in the body. But also there were just other niggling problems that he had that got better. And so it doesn't have to be debilitating. It can just be making you not your most optimal self. And that's something too, why not go for optimal?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be happy, Dr. Crista, I've got a question that's popped into my mind around the testing side of things. Actually, a couple of questions. I know I think it's Dr. Neil Nathan who discusses doing some glutathione pre-mycotoxin testing. So I'm not sure if you'd be happy to share your sort of thoughts on that. And the second one is just around organic acid testing and its, I guess, its potential benefits within exploring an individual's mycotoxin load. Do you have any thoughts on any of those two?
I have a lot of thoughts on those. How much time we have? No, so urine urine mycotoxin testing is a little controversial. Part again, I think that of that controversy is to confuse the picture a little bit about who's to blame, what's to blame for having the presence of mycotoxins. And what's also confusing is it doesn't tell us if it's a now problem or a former problem. So former exposure, that now you have endogenous mycotoxin formation, that now you have, you're carrying the water damage building with you.
Right.
The other thing is with the to provoke or not to provoke. Part of that, I've done a lot of split sample testing. And if you're using the Mast spec method, which is Vibrant Wellness and Great Plains, that method seems to be more consistent if you do not provoke. Now, this is an excretion test. So if the person can't excrete, if they're so toxic, they may get a negative urine mycotoxin test. And then you can use the blood antibody testing. So there's this continuum of, the sickness of the people. What I found is that depending on whether they're on binders or glutathione, but depending on whether they did a sauna or maybe they had intercourse that morning and had ejaculate, which can offload some mycotoxins, there can be a lot of things that can skew the result of that test. And so I have my patients do for 3 days ahead of time. They go on what I call the no mycotoxin foods, the foods that we know are going to either be contaminated with mycotoxins or increase your endogenous fungal overburden. So for 3 days, they go off of those foods. And for me, that takes out part of the argument of, oh, you just ate it. And then I don't typically provoke more than if the person can exercise, that they exercise the day before, make sure they do a good hearty exercise. If they're too sick to exercise, do a hot bath or a sauna or something that will heat the body and try to move the mycotoxins around a little bit. And then we do a first morning urine. So if anybody is listening, you're a practitioner and you want that prep sheet, just let me know. I can email it to you.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's nice to have those little tools.
Yeah.
So my argument to the companies has always been, I really feel like the onus is on them to do the testing. And the new guy in town, Vibrant Wellness, they used to use ELISA method, and I never used them because I didn't like that method. I found that it was way too easily manipulated by the supplements people were on and whether they were on binders or not. By the way, I do have people go off binders for those 3 days as well, if they're on any kind of like pharmaceutical binder or anything like that. So we can get an idea of their total load. So now Vibrant has been open to doing some of this testing so we can figure out what are the confounding factors. They have already done testing to compare a 24-hour urine versus a spot morning urine, and they find that it's not statistically all that different. So it's a lot easier on a patient to do a spot morning urine test. But one of our colleagues, Dr. Philaday, has done day after day after day. He has done so for 5 days in a row, he took his mycotoxins and they were all over the place. So that's something that Vibrant had said, they would be willing to do some kind of study where they're looking at how many days does it take to get a good sample. So maybe we should be collecting for 3 days and then take the aggregate of those 3 days. But what Dr. Philaday did not control for is he didn't control his diet, and he didn't control for whether he had exercised or not, and then supplements. So, those are some of the questions that we have that I think we still don't know. Clinically, for me, I have found that the urine mycotoxin testing has been very helpful in not only identifying who's sick from mold, but also as we see the numbers go down, we see symptoms go down. As we see the numbers go up, we see symptoms go up. So for me, it's been very correlative to how the person is doing. I don't test any sooner than every 3 months because things do get messy and it can really make someone feel like they're not accomplishing the goals that they're trying to accomplish. I also, if they're a very sick person or they're toxic or the person, I think we all know these people are true canaries. Like you hand them a tincture or, a vitamin D or a vitamin B. Vitamin Bs are just terrible for moldies. And they have to sleep with it for a few nights. They kind of have to hang out with the supplement for a little while. Those people, I will run an organic acids test first or a red blood cell glutathione. So I know how sick they are. So if they have a very, very, very low glutathione status, adding glutathione to provoke a test can really make them feel horrible. That's another reason why I don't necessarily just provoke everybody. All of medicine is individual, of course. So if I see on organic acids or on a red blood cell glutathione that they have low glutathione status, then we do some things to get them ready for the test before we do the test, because it will likely come up not adequately showing us what their burden is. Or we would maybe do the blood test. But the blood test, clinically, it's a little hard for me because those positive IgGs to mycotoxins can stay up for 6 months. So therapeutically, as a clinical guide for me, it's not necessarily a useful guide because then we won't necessarily see the reduction that accounts for a reduction in symptoms. If that makes any sense. So what else? Organic acids, you can also tell the difference between someone endogenously making themselves sick. So that colonization, there are some markers on there that identify whether the person is colonized, meaning there's some amount of that water damage building that not only has triggered their own endogenous production, but now has kind of moved into their body. Yeah. And I cover all that in my doc course of what are you looking for? What are the numbers, but yeah, those are my short thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah. Good.
Because I think I've read a paper that talks about sort of glutathione and how mycotoxin inhibit the expression of genes or enzymes involved in its production. Is that right?
Exactly. All mycotoxins deplete glutathione. All mycotoxins deplete NRF2, which is sort of how we handle oxidation, antioxidation in our body. All mycotoxins cause mitochondrial damage. All mycotoxins deplete protein synthesis. So, if you think that's they're basically impairing our engines. And that's why we see fatigue so commonly. So yeah, it gets a little tricky if you're looking at an excretion test, if the person can't excrete. So But I think, again, that continuum of how sick the patient is, the more hardy they are, and if the symptoms, and that tends to mean louder symptoms, by the way. The hardier they are, the more vital they are, kind of the louder their symptoms, and the more we see the mycotoxins adequately represented on the urine mycotoxin test. The sicker they are, the weaker they are, the more toxic they are. It can take 3 weeks to notice they have a cold because it took their body that long to mount the response.
Right.
They feel cruddy because they're floating in cytokines. But, it took until 3 weeks later that we're like, oh, you have a cold. That's what this is. It took that long to get the sore throat, the sinus, so
Yeah.
those people, that's going to be a little harder, and their symptoms tend to be quieter. I tend to see that as we get people better, they start to get louder, scarier symptoms, scarier to them. So I try to prep people. I'm like, okay, that rash you had when you were 5 years old and you were in that moldy basement, that's going to come back. So call me when it does. We know we're getting somewhere when that happens. And we'll celebrate. Yeah. And that's a much better way to approach that phone conversation than, oh my God, I'm getting worse.
Yeah.
My rash. Yeah.
That is such an important point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I've always said to clients, sort of, I think maybe intuitively really, that the test is kind of also an analysis of your capacity to detox. Like, are they actually coming out, and at what level? And I definitely see that in regards to clients not being well, but never getting sick. Like, as you say, they don't really get the bugs that are going round year to year. They're just chronically unwell.
Right. Well, and they may be getting the bugs, but their body just puts them in storage, because they can't handle it. And it's just like all of us, if you get really busy and life is crazy, you sort of just like shove stuff in the closet and deal with it later. So yeah, we'll see often that people get some kind of massive aggravation as they get better. And that's why I have all the things in place to protect and repair before doing this, to really minimize the suffering. A Herxheimer reaction is not a required part of getting better. Getting worse is not a required part of getting better. If you really support the body, it can just get better. It doesn't have to be so noisy.
And on that, my final sort of thought would be, do you find that any of your clients, or speaking with practitioners, is there an emotional element to this? And what I mean by that is, I have a colleague who does a lot of detox stuff, and she often sees almost like an emotional detox at the same time. So sometimes anger starts to come from kind of nowhere, really. Is that something that you see much with sort of the mycotoxin side of things?
Absolutely. Yeah. Irritability, anger can come up. And it makes sense when you think of the body from a Chinese medicine perspective, that the organ system that gets the most burden from this is the gallbladder. And for those that are trained in Chinese medicine, you just went, oh, because you know what I'm talking about. But that's when that is blocked, it can build up a storage of emotions. And so that doesn't necessarily have to mean anger, but it is, anger and irritability is more associated with liver fire and the gallbladder than any of the other emotions. But it could be any emotion. It could be things, losses, griefs, all those kind of things that can bubble up as you detox.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's been really great, Dr. Crista. Thank you. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you would like to, or anything you want to reiterate or conclude with?
Well, I'll reiterate that. I haven't said it, but I'm going to say it and then reiterate it, that air filtration is not an adequate remediation. You do need to remediate a sick space. Air filtration is an aid, but if you're in a water damaged building, there's so much toxin that there's not one air filter that can put up with that or keep up with that. So I do, though, however, realize that most people are stuck in home right now. And maybe for, I don't know, do you guys have stay-at-home orders right now in the UK where you are? Yeah. And so if you're in that environment that's making you sick, this could be really a tough time for you. So there are some supplements that can help support, that we've been shown prevent the toxins from getting into the system and into the cells. And so that could be something that you might want to consider recommending for your clients. And of course, it's always an individual basis, but that would be quercetin, melatonin, DHA, and milk thistle. They've all been shown to really protect the body from taking on more mycotoxins. So that might be something that can hold people together. And then I'll just say, once you can get out, or if you have an exposure to water damaged building, or you're having some of these symptoms and your intuition is saying, I think this is mold, trust yourself. Only you know your body. So that's my advice for people.
No, that's brilliant advice, and really interesting, because I know that Dr. Clara Fitzgerald has talked about quercetin from a kind of Corona-19 perspective, so there might be a double whammy there for some people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I try to pick the things. Melatonin as well has shown
Yeah,
some data, so I tried to pick the things that it's like we know cytotoxic protection from mycotoxins and
brilliant.
some benefit for the COVID. Yeah.
Excellent. Right, I could just sit here all day and ask you questions, but I am mindful of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Crista. That has been really helpful, and I think a lot of the practitioners and public listening will have found it extremely helpful as well.
Wonderful.
Where can people find you, and where can people find your website information, your book, and things like this?
So my website is drcrista.com. That's drcrista.com. And on there I have video blogs, like years worth of 1 minute little thought bubble videos. So if you can't read, don't worry, you can go and get some information by video. There are links to get my book there. Right now, Amazon is not shipping books in the US.
Okay.
So you can order them direct from me. So that on my books tab, you can see there. And then if you're a clinician, you're interested in taking the training course, that's on my courses tab. And that's called, Are You Missing Mold Illness? Because I know I did for a long time. So yeah.
Perfect. And I'll add all of those to the show notes as well.
Great.
So people will be able to find it just on the website.
Yep. And also social media. I'm Instagrammer and Facebooker and get on Pinterest a little bit. So
nice.
Yeah. No Twitter yet for me. It's just seems like a loud environment already, a lot of tweets. So
yeah. No,
I
I'd
don't
agree
know
with
that we
that.
need to add any voices there, but
No. Excellent.
yeah,
Dr. Crista, thank you very much. Hopefully we'll connect face to face at some point in the future.
that would be wonderful.
And I'll be following your work keenly moving forward.
Thank you. Same with you and resiliency. That's what we need right now the most.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.